Hi. I hope you have been having a nice day. I'm going to do a snowy scene. Oops, almost knocked the camera over. I'm going to use this photograph from a fence on my property to indicate some good shadows from the fence. And I shoveled last week up a little path to where I go to feed the horses. There is a tree that is here, and then I'm going to do some of the side slopes here, and I've made up some of the woodland behind. Okay, so that's going to be the beginning. There's a sketch here. And so one of the main things with watercolor is to decide early on how best to approach the painting. So the way that I would approach this one is to start with some very light wash in some areas of the sky, also leaving some of the sky white because it's a very bright shadow, and so it will be for the most part a very blue sky, but also very light sky to create a lot of contrast of the woodland against the sky. And then after I do a little bit of that blue in the background, leaving some white, I'm going to put in the lightest shadows that shape some of the snow as it mounds, and snow that doesn't have anything on it but goes into shadow as it changes away from the light. So I'm going to put in some of the very light shadow, and some of the grasses that are sticking up, just indicate them lightly with some yellows and browns, and indicate the pathway, again, which is just dirt, actually dirt and grass, and that's been shoveled so I can get to the pasture where the horses are. I don't know if I will show these little footsteps, which look like it's something like a rabbit or a fox. And I'll do the lightest shadows, and then only after that do the intense, beautiful blue shadows. This fence will be left all white, and then I will just highlight some of the shape of the fence and the coloring and the mold on the white fence because it hasn't been painted for quite a long time, so it'll have some color to it. I don't think I'll change the color of the fence to make it a plain wooden brown. I think I'll leave it as a white fence, but indicate some shadows on that fence and some dirt on the fence. So that's it. We'll start with a very light, I think over in this area, I'll just put, since the trees will be dark against the very light sky, I don't need to worry about them having a little bit of color in them because they'll be dark anyway on the horizon. So just from more or less the edge of the snow that I can see, I'm going to put a little bit of water there, and then I'm going to mix up a blue, and I think I'm going to go with a cerulean blue, very light, It's a little bit of a nice bright tint to it. And I'm going to make it a little bit darker toward the horizon. And then just stretch it out. Let it be very, very pale. Okay, I think that will be enough of an indication of the sky. And I will leave that alone to dry. Like I said, these trees will be quite dark against the sky, but I'm just making sure that there are no hard edges here. So, then that same blue, I'm going to mix that same blue with a tiny amount of burnt sienna, not very much, so it'll be mostly blue, but just toning it down so it's a neutral, because there are areas where there isn't a bright blue shadow, but there are areas where there are just, in the photograph, some light shadows. And the snow kind of pools, gets wind blown around the posts and creates like a little bit of a bowl around them. So I'm going to indicate that. And a little bit of, that's very common as the wind is blowing. It creates a little bit of a shape and edge. And then over here where I shoveled the snow, there's a little bit of a edge, and it rises up to the top of the snow. I don't want it all the same, it should be varied. Yeah, like that. And then it carries around, and there are some indentations in the snow, but they're not very deep. They're not the kind of intense. See, what we have is we have some light shadows where the sun is coming, but it doesn't have a strong obstacle creating the intense shadow that you see with the fence. So there's kind of a light bit of shadows in some places, but where the sun is really totally blocked, like it is by the fence, then the shadow is very, very blue. And as it slopes down over here, it's actually sloping toward a stream, but we'll just show it sloping. Then also it gets very intense here. And shadows coming from the trees get very intense. But where the indentation in the snow is light, there's a slight shadow, and there's a slight shadow with the indentation around these posts, but the intense, colorful blue shadow is where the light is really totally blocked by the sun. Now, on the path, where this edge of the path is in shadow, it's a little more blue than the other side of the path. So where it's been shoveled, on this side, it's a little more intense. And that's just done with a little less water, the same basic color. Now I'll put some indentations and marks in here that will be darker, but not completely. So there's an edge here from the shoveling. And I'll carry that around here. Okay. And since it is such a bright day, some of these shadows have the most incredibly rich blue color. And there'll even be some rich violet in some of those colors. Now the other thing I want to do is take a flat brush and take a little bit of brown of the burnt sienna and just indicate that there is a little bit of earth dry brush popping up. Let's see if I can get enough. I want enough water in this so that I can wet my brush but make it a bit of a dry brush. So where the path is, got some ground showing through. And then a little bit of marks here and there. Little marks that are not dry brush, that are more wet, have more paint on them. And a little bit of dry brush again. Not too much of that brown, but just a little bit, and I'll go back to putting some blue on there, also on this pathway. Because it is having some shadow on the path from the edge of the snow, there where it was shoveled. So, and then as we go further away, we won't see as much of that, but just to have a little bit indicated. And then down on the bottom of this edge, I'm going to put a little more intense blue and a little bit of I think a little tiny bit of cobalt violet would be a nice color to slip in there. To mix in with the blue. Right. Tone some of that blue down. I don't want to overdo it, but just do a little bit. Maybe I'll take some Quintandone fuchsia or magenta and slip some of that color in. Now slip, because I don't want any of these colors to just be solid one color. So a little bit of mixture in there to show that there's a curved area. And the same around these trees up here. There'll also be this kind of place where the snow has basically created a bit of a pocket around some of the trees. And swept around them, creating a little bit of an indentation. And then a little more very light. Now, one of the things that happens also is there is sunlight on the snow, and I don't want to make it look false, but I would like to just throw in a small amount of that glow of yellow sunlight. So I'm going to put it in the areas just to indicate a little bit of soft, and I think I'm using something like the Hansi yellow for that. So while the snow is very white, we want to have some places where there's variations in color. Makes it interesting for the viewer. Okay. And there'll be some areas where the snow might be dirty even. I'm just going to slip a little bit of brown in some areas. Very light, very subtle. And now the next step is the shadow. See here, I think that's a good one. Looking for the right brush. That would be a good brush for this. I think I'm going to take that same intense cerulean blue and begin to show a shadow coming from the tree. Coming from the trees. And since I put a lot of wet wash in some places up here, I don't want to smudge it with the heel of my hand. So I'm just going to rest my hand on this little gadget that it allows me to hold my hand without messing up the painting. So just on this side here, the sun is coming here, so on the shadow side, I'm dropping in next to some trees. I'm dropping in some very long shadows, and I'm making them up as I go. I have not drawn them in. I'm just indicating that long shadows are coming away from these trees. I know the sketch is very light. I always make my sketches very, very light so you can't see necessarily all the pencil marks, but the indication is that I am going away from trees and drawing long shadows. going away from the trees. And then of course, as the shadows carry out, then they begin to have the branches showing. Okay. But near the tree, of course, the shadows are most intense, right to the right-hand side of the tree. Very intense, so I'm taking a little more blue, and I'm dropping a little more intense color in. And I don't have to have all the edges be perfect. So that's the beginning of that. I may, depending on how many trees I put in a little later, I may add some trees, because I can always add as many trees as I want and little bushes that I want. But for now, at least, at the beginning of some shadows. And in the same way, I'm going to take my color, and where the land is sloping down over here and the snow is falling down the slope, it's in shadow. So I'm going to create that shadow too over here. And in some places it flattens out and then continues. So the slope, but wherever it's sloping away from the sun, there is a shadow that starts to form that is fairly intense. And I'm mixing together here and there some cerulean blue and some manganese blue. The manganese blue is very granular, so it has a very nice effect of granulation, creating a lovely texture. So I'm continuing that, and some of these I'm going to make where it's not as intensely falling down slope to the right. Then the shadow will be a little softer, as it was over here, a little softer. So some of these shadows I'm putting some water in and making them, just showing that the snow is curving and that it's not as much in shadow. Okay. And one could be very precise about this, but the idea is to just give the viewer an impression of what's going on here. And they will, their mind will create their understanding of that impression. So I'm not a realist. Some people would paint this in an extremely realistic way with every pane of grass and every precise shadow, but every artist is different. I like to do it a little more soft and leave some things for the viewer. So, but I am following my photograph pretty well in terms of the basic lay of the land. Here it's sloping up and then softly curving. And it's okay that I put some brown there. It'll give it a slightly different impression, but that's all right. More variation in the glaze, and I can glaze over that brown a little bit. The viewer will will say, gee, I wonder why that's a little different there. And they'll try to figure it out, hopefully, and it'll make the painting more interesting to them. So some areas are more in shadow than others, as the land and the snow curve. And so this just gives us a little indication of what's happening here in this bank. And I'll fill this in because I don't like the eye to go wandering off down the hill. Okay. And I'll make some soft edges here and there. Not completely, some will remain hard, but just some will be softened. And a few little indentations here and there. Maybe a little rabbit came up and hopped along. Here there might be some little critter footprints. There were some actual critter footprints up there. It looks a bit like a deer, actually. Very sharp hooves. But I won't do them precise. Okay. So look how that's made a pretty good start. Pretty good start to this, I think. I'm going to take a little more Quinton-Dome. I'm going to take a little bit of Quinton-Dome magenta and just drop a little bit of that in this blue here and let it bleed. And a little more over here. Where the shadow is more intense. And maybe some of that just by itself. Create some variation. Okay. Softening edges. And I think I'll take a little more of this yellow that I put up here, very softly. And I'll dilute that. A little bit of Hansa yellow, that will really dilute it. Just a little bit here. Yeah. And I'm going to put some of this quinacridone magenta over here in blue. Partly I'm doing that to keep the brighter areas here in the center of the painting from a desire to control the focal point and not have too much bright white down in the edges. So I'm just bringing the eye into the center a little bit by that's too bright there. Good. So and all I'm going to do now for tonight is, and then I'm going to let this completely dry. I'm going to take some more of that cerulean blue. I'm going to mix it with a little bit of cobalt blue. So I've mixed the two together to make it a little more of a solid blue. And I think all this is dry enough for me to put that in, because here I want a very well defined shadow from the fence. And while the fence is straight, because it's falling on snow that is not straight, the shadows will not be straight. They will follow, to some extent, the snow, just as they do in this photograph. And I'm not copying the photograph exactly, but this is the one area of the painting where I'm paying attention to the photograph, because I wanted to also get my perspective correct, and I want to make sure that I'm realistic relative to this shadow. So like I say, I've got a pretty good mixture of fairly strong cobalt blue, because I want it to be a little different than the cerulean and manganese that I used over here. Cobalt blue mixed with the cerulean and creating a very less washy, less water, a little more color, creating a very well-defined. So it begins, the shadow will begin at the post. Some of them are a little longer than others. This is very wet here and I don't want it to bleed, so I'm not going to take it all the way down right now. I'll do that later. Okay, for this shadow, this one shadow, I'm closely following and paying attention to because it almost doesn't look real in the photo that it would be shaped in such a way, but it is shaped in such a way because of the irregularity of the snow and the way the snow varies and which way it's facing, facing toward the sun, facing away from the sun. And the edges are not straight like the fence edges. They're all squiggly and rough because it's nature and that's what's happening there. Okay, let's see here. Now I have to take this shadow down, and in this case the shadow is going to have some irregularities. You can see that bluish green is the cerulean, and I'm going to bring a little more cobalt in, which is just a very plain primary blue. And because it's bleeding there, I'm not going to finish that up right there now. I can do that later. But in the photograph, it's down here, it's bleeding into the shadow as the slope of the land turns. So I'm going to do that here, just to remind myself that that's what's happening here. And it's got some edging here. Okay, so that is the beginning of this painting, which I think there is value in letting it dry and seeing how intense are the colors once they are fully dry, because of course they always dry lighter. I'm going to take a little bit of the violet and put some on this opposite side of the tree there. I'm going to put a little bit also in the intense part of the shadow by the post. That really offsets that. I'm going to do the same thing up here in a few places. A little bit of the quinacridone magenta in a few shadow areas, close to the trees, close to some of these trees. Okay. And I think maybe a touch here and there on the slope of this bank where the shoveling was done. The tiniest bit here and there, just very subtle here and there, to make some marks where the shovel. Yeah, good. I think for now I won't continue down here because it's too wet, and we'll just let this dry and pick up with it later. Well, let me just hold it up a little bit and see if you can see it a little better. I know it looks very bright, but it'll dry a little lighter, a little less bright, but I can always then glaze over with a little bit of color that will tone that down if it's too bright. But I'd rather have it too bright at the beginning than not bright enough. Because this painting basically is all about the shadows, the light and the shadows. So we don't want anything to begin in a way of being muddy. And the reality is that you get some incredible blues, bright blues in the shadows when you have very bright sunlight. And as the sunlight, as it gets a little cloudy, then all the shadows change and become more gray. I hear you, little puppies. I know, you're always saying hello. Somehow you always know when I'm just about done and I should stop. Okay. So that's the beginning. And we'll pick up tomorrow after it dries. Okay, a lot of this is dry. It's nighttime, so I do want to look at this during the daylight before I proceed with parts down here in the snow. But this would be a good time to just take some very dark Van Dyke palette that I have, the browns. I have the Van Dyke brown there, and a little bit of burnt sienna there, and some burnt umber here. Here is a quinacridone burnt sienna. So I'm adding water to some of those palette colors to prepare them to do the background trees, since the sky is completely. And you see how they just the colors just reconstitute. You can see how dark that Van Dyke brown is. This is a lighter burnt umber, and this is a more reddish burnt sienna, and this is a quinacridone burnt sienna. I don't think I want this one. It's very reddish. It's a fire oxide. So what I want to do with those colors is do some browns on these background trees with a small number 2 Escoda versatile brush. So this is a synthetic brush, and I'll take a little bit of that fire oxide. I think it's called fire oxide, that one. So I'll do a little bit of, I've been mixing my colors a little bit, and I'll come in later with some darks, but I want to get started with some fairly light base coat up here on these trees, mostly on the main trunks and the main branches of some trees. Now these are not actual trees in my photograph. These are trees that I have just placed and drawn based on what I think makes a good design with enough diversity. And you saw that we already have a background of very, very light blue with a little bit of whitish up on the top. And I'm going to leave it that way because I think it creates a nice backdrop for the trees, and balances out the snow below. And even though the sky would not be totally white, it'll be very light anyway, so I think that we don't need to do this any more blue than it is. I could stop this and instead just do a little more blue, but I don't think that I need to do that. I think it creates a nice painting to have it very, very subtle. Very subtle, almost white, but not quite. So I'm making these are the main parts of the trees, and then at the very end, with a rigger brush, I'll make some very delicate branch marks, and they will be dark because they're thin and younger and dark in general. So, but they'll be done at the very last minute with the with the rigger brush. So I'm creating a variety of those browns that I showed you. This is the burnt umber. Here. And make a branch up there. And here, a separate branch. I'm going to make this one a little more red and a little more in the background from that one, to differentiate that it's a different one. Two trees, but coming together. I'll do this one with some of the quinacridone burnt sienna, which is a slightly different. Here's the plain burnt sienna. They're similar, but not exactly the same. The quinacridone colors are very transparent, often a bit bright, and whereas the regular burnt sienna is not as transparent, and it's more of a granulating color, whereas the quinacridone colors tend not to be granulating, and they tend to be very, very transparent. So if you're focusing on making glazes with transparent color, they do a very nice job. So I just put a little bit here and there. See, it's just a little more red, and it's burnt quinacridone burnt sienna. And I'll take a little bit more of that Van Dyke brown down here in the trunk on the shadow side. On the shadow side, I'll make it a little darker there. Over here also on the shadow side, just make it a little more dark there. So I'm just thinking about how trees are formed, how they break off some large branches, grow about 10, 15 feet up, and come out. And the tree kind of is almost like two trees instead of one, because some of those, it splits and forks. So let's see, I've got a tree here that is very slanted. Put a little bit of that quinacridone burnt sienna in. Give it a little slight reddish hue. A little bit of Van Dyke down on the bottom. This is the Van Dyke brown, which is the darkest brown on my palette. And this one also a little slanted with the Van Dyke brown. And then I'm going to bring in some of the burnt umber, make it slightly different cast than the ones that are burnt sienna, and have a reddish tone. So I'm just playing with the browns. And then I'll put a little bit of darker shading on the main trunks and branches, and then do the fine branches. I think I can do that one there. I'm going to have to make this trunk a little wider to support those big branches coming off where the tree is split. Just making some diversity, not too much because I don't want it to be a big distraction, but we can always blend them a little bit more with another glaze. But for now, I like the idea of having them have all these little deviations, be each one something unique. And these were not in the photo, these are just made up. I've taken thousands of photos of trees and different kinds of trees, and looked at their different behavior and shapes and sizes and how the roots come out and how they get knots sometimes in the center. You know, there might be a bump or a knot. But the thing is, each one is unique, and I'm putting them in these little places where we made some shadows. You couldn't see the drawing very well, but now you can tell what I'm doing. There's this one tree that was actually on the property, and it is one of my trees, and that was in the photo. So this one is here. For the most part, in this area, what we have are maple trees, a lot of maple trees. Have some elm, and a lot of oaks. And their bark, of course, would be very different from one to another, and their shapes are a little different. We also have some sycamores, but I'm not those are more rare. I'm not showing them in this image. And in this one, I'm not showing evergreens. We would have some evergreens, but I've decided not to put in evergreens because it would create a shape. I prefer to, if I'm going to do evergreens, I prefer to do them in a cluster of a group of evergreens, because they would block out the whole sky. And I made a decision early on that I wanted to have the sky be mostly an empty space, and then very white with minimal blue showing, in order to highlight the fact that this is a very light sky with a lot of sunshine off to the left, and not a lot of color in it. So just doing that, and we add a little more burnt sienna over here to just make this a little more colorful, mixing the two, and a little darker on this side. This will be the only really big tree, and it's got a nice big dark shadow, as you can see. Put a drop in while it's wet, a little mix of both the Van Dyke and the burnt sienna. And here on the shadow side. And then there's another good sized tree here in the background. Okay. And then after looking at this in the daylight, because it is night now, it's about 10, then I'll see where I need to do more work. Drop some water there, so I dripped some water there. I don't want to do that. And one of the things, while it's still wet, I want to make sure that these trees are connected to the earth with some roots. So I'll just put in some of those roots and some weight down on the bottom of some of these trees. To make sure that they're rooted in these shadow places where the snow has made a little wind-blown bowl around the base of the tree. This is just the start of that, but just enough while the washes are still wet to make sure that it's indicated. And then tomorrow we'll put in more detail. But now I guess while it's wet we'll do this so that this wash has a chance to dry. And drop some color there. Don't want to do that. I want to continue that tree back here. I need to just put some branches and continue this one a little bit. And then much smaller, finer trees will be put in after this is all dry. So one of the things I like to show you is how to approach the painting area by area so that some areas get a chance to dry while you work in other areas, and that enables you to preserve the whites of the paper and keep that glow as much as possible. I'm going to put a little bit of a base on this one, not too much, just a little one, so it's not sitting up in midair. Bring some of these down, really root them down in the ground, which is an important element. Okay, maybe I need another one over here. Very subtle one. Not too much. Okay. So this scene is beginning to evolve. It's just a matter of thinking about how does the tree grow, how is each one unique, making sure the base is a little wider as we grow up and go up, and then other branches coming off. Okay. I think that's a reasonable point to stop and let this dry. We'll continue this tomorrow. See you then. Okay. Well, I've just taken a walk outside, and I'm looking at my reference photo, and in the walk outside I went out to study some of the shadows in the bright light that fortunately does exist outside today. And I'm trying to see where to put a little bit more shadow and what tone it should be, what level of value, contrast it might be, and not ruin the painting. And so I've decided to put a little bit of light shadow over here, a small amount of light shadow over here, a little bit of light shadow in here, in different places, and very little bit right in there. And I'm going to make that shadow and I've decided not to touch this at this point. I'm not going to tone down these bright blues at this point. I'm going to leave them just as they are. So, and then I am going to tone down the trees a little bit and darken some of the trees. But I'm going to add some light trees in a bit of a blue hue. So let me mix some color here of the color that I need. I'll put in some, I want it to be, to granulate just a little bit. So I'm going to put in some burnt sienna, which will do that. And instead of automatically going to the ultramarine blue, I'll start with a little cobalt blue, which will add the blue and change the tone to a gray, but is not granulating in the same way that the ultramarine would granulate. It's not quite as blue as I'd like. I'll add a little bit of ultramarine. My puppies have just come out of their nighttime pen and they're playing in the kitchen. They play in the kitchen 1 to 2 hours for 4 times a day. I'll take my spray and go over there and tell them to be quiet. Let's see if that works. Okay, I think that's a nice tone. It's a bluish tone, it's dark enough, and as I add water, you can see it can be lighter or it can be darker. So that's the color I'm going to use to make these shadows, with the most watery one right here. Some of it will glaze a little bit over that yellow there. And I'll put my photo there so you can see. I'm going to put a little bit of discontinuous, because it also kind of reflects where I threw snow when shoveling that path. And then I'll drop in a little bit of the darker here and there. You see how I'm doing that? And a little bit discontinuous to show the roughness of the snow. I don't want to emphasize that roughness too much, but at the same time, we don't have a cliff of snow for no reason. We have a cliff of snow because I shoveled and threw snow up on top. In the same way, I have a bit of that same rough diversity of snow on this side. And so I'll add a little bit of shape to this mound of snow. Well, they listen for a moment. They'll tone down. That's a play bark. That bark, that high-pitched bark there is come in play. So they're just happy-go-lucky. And then I'm going to do a shadow color up here. That's a little darker, as if there's something over here shining some shadow down. And I'm doing that for 2 reasons. It creates some interest in the continuity of the woodland, indicating that there's more going on back here. And I also want to keep the eye, so I'll drag some of that down, indicating their shadow here. And I'll put toning some of these shadows down. And I'll put some up here, and that will begin to indicate the horizon. going off into the distance. But I'm leaving some white at the same time because I don't want it to be all in shadow up there. I want the sense that there's some bright areas of snow there. In the same way you see bits of snow going off into the horizon here. So I'll put some shadow here and there because some of the shadow is coming from the canopy of the trees at this point too. And it's coming down in a diverse way. In a soft way, I don't want any hard edges here. I'm coming in now with my damp brush cleaned off and softening edges just to make sure that there's not any hard shape in that shadow. Because it's kind of a mystery shadow. You know that there's something there, you see that there's shadow, you're not quite sure everything that's in that faraway place, and there's bits of bright snow and bits of shadow, leaving it to the eye to, this is getting very watery there, leaving some lighter color here, softening all these edges. I don't want any hard edges in here. Okay. And some more watery shadow here, and some spaces. And some darker areas. And some water to soften those edges there. Some darker areas here and there. And with the darkest one over on this edge here, going off into the distance, toning down some areas here, making some little bit darker here. Just doing that to, again, create a little diversity. A little more mystery here and there. What's making those shadows? What's happening back there? And also just at this point to create value contrast in some areas. And some diversity in some of these shadows here. So that in some places the snow is a little deeper, some places it's a little bit here in this crevice. This crevice is an important part of the painting. Can even indicate some time, a little indication of, I'm just doing that, there isn't really a line, but it indicates that the way that the snow has moved and drifted there. I might do a couple more of those lines here and there. I don't want to do them too much. Just a little more shadow diversity here and there. And I'm going to put some shadow lines here and there now too, because I'm going to put some grasses in this area, and I'll put the shadows down so that it'll indicate there where I'm going to be putting some grasses. Grasses popping out of the, I'm going to put some grasses over here too. They'll be popping out of the snow in that area, and they'll be a very light brown. And a little more over here. And then I'm going to just intensify the shadow on the path a little bit. And the path is going to be rough and have lots of footprints on it. So I'll just put some dots for all my little footprints on my path that is shoveled here. Rough, make it rough, and put some layers above the above the original layers, indicating the roughness of this path here. You see what I mean? Hopefully that begins to look like a path with lots of little. You can see that the footprints are there in the photograph. Sometimes we don't notice things that are in the photograph until a little later. You see, oh, I need a little bit of roughness there, a different kind of stroke, a little bit different. Okay, this is starting to come out pretty well. Now I'm going to take that same group of colors. I'm going to take a little bit of the Van Dyke brown now, a little Van Dyke brown and cobalt blue, and it'll create another neutral in that earlier pool of neutrals. It's a little bit different. And let me add a little bit of burnt sienna. I don't want it too different from the earlier one. But you can see that it has a brownish cast, like the other one. And what I want to do with this is create some very light trees in the background. Get a small brush, and I want it a little more bluish. I'm going to put a little more blue in there. I'm going to put some more remote trees over here. And because they're further away, they're a little more bluish. That's just the way things look. They change, color changes a little bit as it moves away and goes into shadow. So I'm just putting some more trees, making them a bit watery. Making this more of a woodland and less of it looking like somebody came along and just planted a few trees here and there on a grassland, but making this really begin to look a bit more like a woodland. Not necessarily continuous lines, but soft lines to indicate. And in some places make it look like there might be a lot of things back there. You see what I mean? Just a bit here and there. Not necessarily continuous, but to indicate the woodland goes on off into the distance. And some bits of snow covered up. Some marks with dropping in a little more color. Some marks very light and faded. Some marks a little more color, dropping it into the wet. And just continue that process. Making some lines here and there, very subtle. And as these trees rise up into the bright sky, the sunlight kind of washes out their color even more, makes them very, very faded in color. Okay? So you just need to think about what is happening with the light and with the images as they transition into distance. They become oftentimes a little more blue in cast. I'm adding a little more blue here for some of these distant lines, making them very soft and subtle. Some places the ground is, and the combination is a little darker. Other cases, the bright light of the white. I want to have some glow of very bright light there, as if there's spaces showing through. And in other places, I want it to be a little, the shadows to be a little stronger together and less light. So I'm going to leave some spaces, but not too many. And some of those trees might be a little bit at an angle, so I can show that. I can show that they aren't all necessarily straight. Some of them are going sideways a bit, and some of them usually all in toward one direction, but you see what I mean? And then I'll have a few of these. I'm dropping in a little bit of color into that wet mixture, just to create a little bit of difference in the light and dark. Very subtly. So you get the impression that there's some change in detail and change in light, but you're not really sure what it is. But there's something going on back here with some diversity in the value. You see what I mean? And I'm doing all this with brush stroke. I'm not splattering in here. I'm just subtly mixing things in with my brush stroke. A little diversity. Now that I have the first layer, a little bit more layering, and that will bring some don't be afraid to use your finger now and then to blend, or maybe there'll be some little steps, some diversity in the snow. And some of these shadows in the snow might be a little more brownish like this. That's okay too. It doesn't have. And here I'm going to put a little more brownish. Some places that will tone down some of those blues, but still keep them in other areas. And then deepen, intensify some shadows. In the center of the shadow, it might be a little more, a little more dark. because the light doesn't go all the way around the tree, and so the shadow can be a little more dark in the center of some shadows. A little more of the brown in some of those centers of the shadows, but not everywhere. Okay? I think that that's a fairly reasonable amount of detail. Down here on this shadow, I'm going to put a little bit of that darker here and there to give that shadow a little bit of shape, as if it's curving in on the slope for a little bit and making some darker spaces. Do the same thing over here, not everywhere, but in some areas. And maybe I'll make a little bit of lines here and there. And over here where I'm going to have some plants, I'll put down some little darker shadows, and I'll have the plants coming up in there. Again, I'm going to, perhaps near the pole, put a little bit of that brownish shadow in the center of some of these lines. To give it a little bit of diversity, and also in the center of some of those pools of shadow around the pole, near the pole. The pole is really sitting down into that ground, making a deep, deep anchor in the snow there. And so I'm just trying to think like light and think like what is there and how it would behave. There. You see what I mean? And I'll do the same thing. There should be, I think, a little more deep shadow coming out in the path. Less blue, more of this neutral gray that I've just made. In the darkest place away from the sun. There. A little more accent. And the nice thing about that is that it creates then a set of these parallel lines that we're going to have as the focal point of the thing. And they're all kind of pointing at this tree. So what we have, once I paint this fence, we'll have the shadow, the fence, and the walkway all kind of pointing in the direction of this tree. So I'm just going to put a little bit more accent around that tree, not too much, and the grasses that will be here, and that is basically the design of this painting. It's not a happy accident. I did plan it that way. And so I'm putting a little more color here also. Behind the tree here, a little more shadow there, and a little more here, just deepening it there. So everything will be coming here. I'll put the most detail on this tree here. And I'm going to leave this very vague here, even though in the photograph there's a lot of depth in here. I don't want to overdo that. So I'm just reinforcing these lines a little bit, which also, and I'll put the tiniest amount, because since everything is convening that way, I'll put a small amount of bluish neutral right in here. Okay, you see what I'm doing? But I can't make it too obvious. It becomes a bit contrived. All right? But I'm basically, in a way, what I'm doing in my mind is I'm pointing the eye, and I'll put a little tiny bit over here. I'm basically leading the eye up here. Very subtle, but I think you can see what's happening there. Okay, this is a good break point. The next the next step after everything dries here would be to put in a few grasses and to put some detail into some of the trees and to put in the fence. I've turned off the studio lights for a minute, and I just wanted you to see this wonderful movement. The morning light is outside, coming through the window panes, and I wanted to show you the dance of the light on the paper. I think it's really beautiful. And also it gives you an idea of how the light coming through the trees outside my window, there are a lot of hemlock and maple trees outside my window. And I just want you to see the dance of the light coming through the window. And I'll move away the spray bottle and my water container, so you can just watch that for a moment, because everything in painting is really about shadow and light and contrast of the two. There's also contrast of colors and complements of colors. But the most important thing is the dance of the shadow and the light. And so the window, of course, ends here. And you can see some window pane marks coming here. But the wonderful movement of the trees it's a very gentle breeze outside this morning. But the wonderful movement of the trees on the paper gives you some idea of how that would also be happening of the light on the snow. So that's just a little insert here, a little bit of magic that I noticed this morning and I wanted to share with you. When we come back, we're going to put some of that dancing diversity of light to create some diversity in there, in this shadow, and then we'll put the details into the trees. Okay, the painting is dry, so I'm going to start the final step of I always tweak paintings over a couple of days. But there are a few details I want to add so I can get this video out to my class, because we'll be painting this scene tomorrow in class. So the first thing I'm going to do is take that color that we mixed with the blue and the Van Dyke brown. I'm going to reconstitute it on my mixing dish, which is the cover of my palette. I'm going to reconstitute it, add a little more blue, darken it. I think I'm going to add a little bit of Payne's Gray to that. Not that it needs it, because it's more or less similar in color to Payne's Gray, but that will just intensify the color a little bit. Okay. So I'm going to take that and I'm going to make some of these grasses with my rigger brush, my very thin rigger brush. So some of the grasses are shorter, some of them are taller and longer. But there's some diversity of grasses. Some of them are a little thicker and darker. And just create a little bit of connection of grasses. Some are shorter. So that's continuing to build up in that area there. Some of them might have some little seed pods up on the top, little bits of dots of seed pods. See? It's just indicating what they might be like. And as I go down toward this tree, maybe there'll be a couple coming out of this little pocket of exposed ground around the tree, and some on the downside of the tree also, adding that detail around the tree. And then I've got a few more random grasses over here that I had shown you that I had put some shadow here, and a few dots showing some seed pods on the end of some of these grasses. They aren't really evident. There aren't any seed pods evident in the photo that we're using as a reference, but that doesn't matter. When you look at grasses a lot over your lifetime of looking and photographing and studying, one of the beautiful things about painting is that it helps you to learn to see. Because the more that you paint, the more that you become observant. And the same is in photography, but more so when you're reconstructing things in painting, you have it more. So I don't want to overdo the seed pods. I may have overdone it just a little bit. I'll put some dark ones in. So some of them have a shadow at the base, but some of them are just random grasses popping out. Let's see, I think I'll put a few, I don't know. There, in the reference photo there are some down here, but I think I'm not going to take the chance of overdoing it. And now up here, there will also be, on some of these trees, there'll be some grasses near the tree, protected by the tree, and coming up. And in various places here, there'll be some grasses and some twigs and bushes. And we'll just do a little bit in the trees that are close, because as you go further away, you wouldn't see that detail. But we'll do some here and there. Maybe at the base of this tree, we'll do some, just a little bit, and they'll be smaller over here because, and there'll be places where There'll be little clusters of grasses just now and then in some of these shadow areas, but not too much. Okay. And then I did say that I would make some calligraphic marks of branches coming off some of these limbs. And so I'm going to start to do that with my rigger while I've got my rigger in my hand. I'm going to also do some more detail on the trunks, but while I've got my rigger here, I'll do some marks, some fine marks in here of little narrow trees, and just some little bit of finer marks. Just moving my palettes away so I can get my hands in to do some of those finer marks. Up here, every now and then some thin, finer marks of thin growth, seedling kind of growth, and branches. I wouldn't overdo it to create too much clutter, but a certain amount with the rigger to indicate branches. Okay. So, it's a good time to just stop and I'll just put a little bit more marks showing undergrowth, a little bit of undergrowth back there, ever so lightly. Of course it will dry lighter, but ever so lightly. You can see there's quite a lot of undergrowth in various places, so in some places I'll show more and other places less. There, I think that's enough. Anything too much will be a distraction. Now, for the sake of harmony in color, I'm going to use some of that same tone on the back side of this board. Take some water and blend it in a bit. Because the back side of this white board will be in shadow. So I'm going to use that same bluish brown neutral that was made to show. And I'm leaving a little white area on the top of the board. And just painting some shadow area on the side. And then I'll take that rigger again and just do the slightest line to indicate the front of the board, front of the top of the board. There. And the beginning of the back of the board. A bit of line at the top of the shadow there. Not too precise, just enough to indicate that the board has some dimension. bottom of the board. Okay. Now I'm going to take a little bit of I have a brush that is a funky little brush. One can also just do some dry brush. But I want to just indicate on this board some texture. So this is a funny little brush that has some cutout areas. So it's like holding 4 different brushes at once, creating some marks that are separated. I think I got this brush locally at the Washington Supply, which carries a little bit of art supplies. And people that are members of the Washington Art Association get a discount there. A little plug for a local hardware store. Okay. And I'm going to put in some darker colors here and there, because there is basically the board is white, but hasn't been painted for about 10 years, so it's got mold on it. So I'm just going to indicate some of this discoloration of the board with a little bit of Payne's gray. Okay. And do the same thing with this board below. Leaving a space at the top where it's white, but behind the post in this case, it would be in shadow. The back of the posts are in shadow. So if we show that shadow on the back of the post, you can see it a little better. And then the board in the back of the post would be in shadow. And this is all done with that neutral that was created with blue and Van Dyke brown and just a touch of burnt sienna. There's no light coming through here. All right, and then in the same way, leaving a little bit of white on the top of the board where it's in the light as it comes up to the pole, and then showing the pole, the bottom of the pole in the same way, and building in with a little bit of dry marking the shadow of the pole, and the coloring of the pole in the same way we did above, because it's in shadow and it's also got mold on it. Just going to make the shadow some lighter tones to the shadow. because the entire back of the board is in shadow. None of it should really be bright to light. But I don't want it to be super solid. I want it to have a little diversity of light and dark. Okay, then once again, I'll take my rigger and show the front edge of that board, just so that it's clear that the board has a top white edge. I don't want it to, the white edge wouldn't really show there on the back of the board, but it's showing in other places. So I'm just following my pencil line down here. And again, I just want to sharpen up this edge a little bit also on the bottom of the board. With the rigger, which creates a very nice thin line. And I'll make the board stick out a little bit beyond the post there. And in the same way, just going to sharpen up the edge a little bit, not all the edges, but some of the edges of the pole that is sticking up, just to define it a little bit here and there. I don't want it continuous necessarily, but sharpening it up just a little bit. Sharpening that up also. Again, we don't want a lot of sharp edges, just a few to just indicate the structure here. There is some shadow. The shadows under the board would be a little bit darker. So I'm showing them, because there would be then the shadow of the board above, as well as the shadow from the sunlight to the left. So under the boards, you'll see a little more shadow, and I'll put a little more edge. I'm just thinking about how does the light move. So there's some shadow from above and shadow from the front where the sun is. Okay. Now, as this has dried, it has become a little less defined. So just put a little more color in and intensify some of those marks. They tend to bleed together a bit, so we just put a little more intensity again. I'm doing all of this with my rigger, following my pencil lines. Now, the other thing I'm going to do is make I'm taking that same color, but making it very, very watery. just very, very watery, and putting some, too dark. Yeah, just putting a little bit of color, very, very watery color. I have to find some area that's a little more water. Yeah. Just putting some color on that post because it's slightly on the side. You see, the sun is coming from here, so there'll be a slight amount of shadow on this side, but a much darker shadow on the back side. You understand? The sun is coming from here, so there is some shadow on these posts, but not as much. Not as much. So this is a lighter shadow and a warmer shadow, a little more brown, a little less blue. It's a warmer shadow because it's partially, these posts are partially in the sun. There. And the very last part I will do is detailing on the trees. This tree here, I'm going to get those same neutral tones, carrying them forward, putting some bark in here. Putting some bark in, very subtle. And some shadow on this side of the tree to show the roundness of the tree as it turns away from the light. There's shadow on this side of the tree. Since this is a bigger tree, we can see that more prominently than we can with the other trees. because it's bigger, then it would hold more darkness on its far side. All the trees will have some darkness on the side away from the light, but the bigger trees will have more because they're just larger and the sun cannot get around to the backside of those trees as well. But as it goes up into the light, then the sun can go around some of those smaller branches. And then in the crevices, we always see an intensity of shadow in the crevices. And down at the base, as the tree gets wider and bigger, you see a little bit more. And I'm bringing in some very dark here. There. And a thin amount of dark on some of these smaller trees. Not all of them, but on some of them, just to indicate, especially the bigger ones. Again, like this, not as much as that one very big tree in the forefront, but on some of these. Making this tree a little wider, giving it a little more shape and a little more width. It's nice to have them, a few trees, be a little bigger. So in some cases I'm taking some straight Payne's gray that is very dark, and really now deepening the shadow in a few places to have the value contrast that I want, given that this area over here is my focal point. So I'm making this more intense. I'm carrying some of that root down here, building up the intensity in this area right here. And a little, carrying it right up a little bit there on the side of the tree. And mirroring it a little bit with this little tree down here. So putting just a touch more detail here, some grasses, little darker grasses, just echoing again. This is my focal point, and I just want a little more strength in that area there. These others will have shadows too, but they're further away. They won't be as prominent. So I'm just taking a number 2 brush here, putting in some, the same color but with a little more water in it, indicating shadows, some shadow on the sides of the trees and down near the roots, the base of the trees. Not all of them, just very subtle here and there. And making those trees, connecting them to the ground. Connecting the trees to the ground with some marks. Just making sure that they don't look like they're floating up on the top of water. So building in some connections with some marks. And I think for the most part, this painting is done. I might tweak it here and there with a little bit of light, but I hope you enjoyed the process. And painting is ready. Thanks. Thanks for joining me. I really, for those of you that do watch the whole video, I know it's long, but I hope you get something out of it. I appreciate it. Bye.